Hello and most welcome to 1158. For some mad reason I found a chapter from the book The Seeking Soul by Richard E. Lind. I don't know how it came to me. It is not on the net. I checked. It's a bit of mystery. I'm still looking for the book. It seems that I'll have to order it from abroad somewhere. Well, just get to the chase. I think this is the sign from synchronicity or God, whatever you like. The problem of seeking, chapter 1 of the searching self or the searching soul, our way to God or spirituality. Serious seekers of self-realization and transcendence are usually discontented or disillusioned with life and blame themselves for their disturbing situation. Discontent motivates a strong desire to quickly and radically change the self, to erase embarrassing faults and failures, and to find a way to transcend the sorrows and futility of existence. In it, disillusionment results in a need to recreate a credible belief that life will, after all, be rewarding and meaningful. Under these negative circumstances, it is natural to look for a cure, a belief system, and a discipline that will end discontent and hopelessness. There have always been a variety of traditional, marginal, and radical cures for the suffering of discontented and disillusioned. Each system offers various beliefs and disciplines, and claims its methods to be reliable means for obtaining ideal outcomes. But there have also been critics of these cures throughout Western history. For the ancient Greeks, recognition and acceptance of one's fate was the first and most important step toward experiencing a good life. To attempt to alter one's fate was impious, dangerous, and bound to provoke the wrath of the gods. Theognis, 6th century BCE, summarized this point of view as follows. We are helpless, it is hard, but we are caught and confined. We are men, what we think in vanity, for we know nothing. All is disposed of by the gods in the way they wish. And from Simonides we hear the following. Any man is good while his luck is good. He is bad when bad, and for the most part they are best whom the gods love. Therefore I will not throw away my time and life into unprofitable hope and emptiness, the search for that object which cannot possibly be, for the generation of fools is endless. The later Epicurean, skeptic and Stoic philosophers of Greece and Rome understood suffering to be the consequence of false beliefs and empty strivings. The cure of suffering was to stop believing in and stop seeking after unrealistic ideals, those illusory cultural and spiritual goals that falsely promise the attainment of happiness and the end of suffering. For these philosophers, the suspension of judgment, false hopes, and empty strivings was the only way to achieve ataraxia, or peace of mind. Similarly, in the Christian tradition, the sin of pride or sanctimonious seeking came to be identified as the primary sin, and the great gateway to all other sins. To seek perfection or salvation was to turn away in a prideful abandonment of submission to God. It was an attempt to assert the governance of God over soul and replace it with the governance of the personal conscience. But no matter how well informed the conscience was about religious laws and communal ethics, this was no substitute for the gift of grace. For through the experience of grace, God's love was freely given and not won by human strivings. Over the last few centuries, however, with the liberalization of Christianity and the secularization of society, even the minority of traditional religious critics of seeking have disappeared. The seeker is currently confronted with a Babylonian feast of religious and secular prescriptions for positive change. Each claims to provide the one true way to the one true God. And each of them says, if you identify with these beliefs and dutifully perform these disciplines, you live happily ever after. And here are some testimonials to prove it. Yet while new disciplines of self-realization seem to work for a few individuals, there are diminishing returns as enthusiasm wanes, and it became clear that these individuals are the exceptions rather than the rule. Within the last 20 years, the psychology section in bookstores has often been renamed or supplemented by self-help sections. This change of emphasis reflects the unmet needs and untreated symptoms of modern individuals. As the current therapeutic establishment has become increasingly unresponsive to many of the concerns addressed by the self-help literature, in particular to the pursuit of various prescriptions for the attainment of self-realization and transcendence by the worried well. This type of self-help literature has been readily available and popular for several centuries, and its content has not significantly changed since the late 19th century. Its rhetoric introduces seemingly new spiritual concepts and techniques and embed these concepts in both secular scientific language and in the language of traditional and esoteric religions, based on the claim of being a new discovery or method. Radical promises of ideal outcomes are made. But few, if any, of these concepts and techniques are new, and without exception, they are almost entirely useless for the pursuit of self-transformation, except as elaborate diversions and placebo. In most cases, these pseudo-solutions are ultimately harmful to those who take them seriously. In this health self-culture of individual seekers, psychological development and progress are portrayed as self-initiated and self-sustained through practical disciplines combined and contained in how-to manuals, promising the attainment of whatever type of ideal goal one chooses to pursue. This literature promotes the idea that one need only follow certain practices and disciplines, and attainment of the good life will naturally follow. Self-help literature is based on the assumption that efforts towards self-improvement are usually effective and worthwhile, and for some limited goals as diet, exercise, and relaxation, this may sometimes be true, but the majority of the claims and promised benefits, especially those oriented towards self-realization and transcendence, are overstated and misleading. Seekers should be aware of those claiming to offer disciplines and practices that produce radical positive change. All of these claims are false because there is no method, practice, or discipline through which to reliably and predictably achieve self-realization, transcendence, or reintegration. Those who claim to have found self-realization or transcendence and then attempt to convince others of their self-serving interpretation of their experience are misleading their potential followers. This is due to the false assumption that their followers can reproduce the point of view and alleged success acquired by these self-appointed authorities. But neither transcendence, perfection, or transformation can ever result from imitation. To seek to become one's or someone else's ideal has always been and will continue to be a path of self-destruction. Those who cannot or will not give up seeking remain trapped in their dependence upon successful performance, just to justify the sense of personal worth, their self-esteem. Their resistance is natural and a sign of where they are in the process. That is, caught up in an errant belief that they are building up the self, rather than realizing they are tearing it apart, even though faintly recognizing that resistance toward accepting who and what they are is futile. Their empty striving remains compulsive, a survival issue out of the bounds of voluntary choice and control. Inappropriate, excessive seeking in its various forms is one of the root causes of the ills of both modern individuals and modern society. In American culture, compulsive seeking is not only common but expected. Rather than fostering stability and acceptance, however, compulsive seeking easily becomes short-sighted, destructive, and goads individuals to excess. But many seekers have never suffered enough to be forced into recognizing the failure of their self-serving endeavors. In these cases, one might speculate that they did not strive hard enough, since they never became completely dedicated to the seeking of their ideal. They neither reach a point of crisis where a voluntary decision to end seeking seemed appropriate, nor the point where an involuntary giving up and reintegration would occur. Despite their resistance, in fact, the majority of ambivalent seekers spend most of the time avoiding the problems that motivate compulsive seeking, and in this way avoid the compensatory seeking of perfection and transcendence. Instead of seeking, one indulges in various diversions, placebo and escapism. One reads a novel or watches a movie about a heroic seeker, or buys a product associated with a celebrity who corresponds to one's ideal of self-realization. One becomes a voyeur, watching others act out one's own ideals in various media, such as watching television, sports, and reading about success stories in the news. The seeking of the self in this way is delayed, subverted, and avoided. And the tension and conflict necessary for the problem of seeking to be recognized and resolved is never sufficiently aroused. Indulging in fantasies of heroic quests, diverted by the demands of work, relationships, recreation, drugs, and medications, distracted by the many other demands of living in modern society, serious seeking is put off until later. Since in this manner, most modern individuals never allow significant suffering from serious seeking to occur, they are never really forced to confront the futility and self-destructiveness of this process. They suffer, but not enough to question their ambivalent identity as a seeker, nor do they suffer enough to force the futility of seeking to the point of resignation and involuntary reintegration. Paradoxically, this is why only serious seekers who flagrantly tear themselves apart time and again are those who experience reintegration. Apparently, they force the issue to the point where the only alternative to self-destruction, that is, reintegration, seems to be happening on its own accord. The distinction between serious and ambivalent seekers is therefore important toward understanding the consequences and outcomes of seeking. It is also important to distinguish the different types of seeking available to the modern self. The 4 types of seeking. There are now 4 general prescriptions for positive change: seeking transcendence, self-realization, self-fulfillment, and self-transformation. Transcendence. Traditionally, transcendence has been described within the Western tradition as salvation or grace, while the Eastern traditions it has been described as enlightenment. A state in which the desires and concerns of the self and the world lose their power of domination over the individual. Transcendence means that the achieved goal seems final, even though it may be short-lived, because it removes any further need of self-interested seeking, it representing achieving a superior state of consciousness in a vertical ascension above and beyond, at least for a time, independent of the psychological context of the seeking self. Unlike the descent and feeling of groundedness that is actually characteristic of reintegration, transcendence is more of an escape upward into an alternative consciousness than the rediscovery and transformation of an existing form of consciousness. The second is self-realization. Self-realization includes all of the esoteric and mundane disciplines for self-improvement. From psychoanalysis to self-help prescriptions, self-realization is not oriented toward transcendence, but toward achieving an ideal state of being and functioning in, and by standards of this world, self-realization does not usually result in an end to seeking, which will often continue in altered form from one goal to the next with no final end. While perfection of the self is the ultimate goal of self-realization, there are endless stages and plateaus to be achieved on the way to this elusive goal. Perfection is never finally achieved, but only more closely approximated, as seeking is endlessly renewed and the goal of perfection is endlessly reformulated. The third is self-fulfillment. Self-fulfillment is the more ordinary and pragmatic accumulation of knowledge, positive recognition, and wealth that has become the predominant form of seeking in Western modern democracies. Although the problems associated with seeking self-fulfillment are not properly addressed in this book, these problems are often very similar to transformations to those associated with other forms of seeking, which leads us to self-transformation. Self-transformation refers to the reintegration of all those parts of the psyche that have become dissociated, split off, or repressed from consciousness, and is experienced as a regrounding. Complete reintegration or self-transformation implies a unitary state of consciousness fundamentally different from and opposed to the divisive psychological context of the seeking self. Following self-transformation, identity is contained in and experienced through the body, which is now perceived as an open vessel in communion with the world. This vessel relates through the imagination of embodiment and the perspective of the other, rather than through egocentric analysis. Subjectivity tends to be relocated to some degree in the body, as opposed to the head. For example, in the regions of the heart and abdomen. The experience of an integrative rounding of consciousness indicates that, unlike Eastern descriptions of transcendence as a movement upward and out through the head, Westerners experience integration. Kan ta lite kaffe.
Yes.
As a downward movement of subjectivity and awareness from head to heart to navel or abdomen, and then out into the world. It is this downward movement, a reincorporation of the psyche, occurs that is a crucial preparation for the Western experience of soul and spirituality. But paradoxically, experiences of reintegration are often misunderstood as a form of transcendence or even of self-realization. It is likely that much of the literature on the goals and experience of transcendence and self-realization is actually based on integrative experiences that are misinterpreted in terms of the language used to describe these other goals. The confusion results because the current literature on the transcendence and self-realization often does not distinguish between any of the above goals. This is especially true of the self-help literature, where metaphors for all types of goals and prescriptions for their attainment are mixed in and metaphor for all types of goals and prescriptions. And they are all mixed in an eclectic brew of idealism. For any particular individual, there are likely to be multiple goals and no clear distinctions between them, all of them muddled together in a general desire and search for the good life and the avoidance of suffering. The average person not only works long hours, but sometimes has extra jobs or is getting extra training. Husbands and wives both work. In this process, the present is sacrificed for the future well-being, such as promotions, vacations, and retirement, all for the sake of the children who are also in full-time training for the future. Behind all this lurks a desire to obtain sudden fame, wealth, or to rise above it all in some spiritual transformation of consciousness, but self-sacrifice for future benefit, for the sake of a future reward or an idealistic outcome, is nearly always a futile attempt to manipulate fate. The money may be there, but the person who saved it will not be. In contrast to this frenetic way of life, all individuals ultimately wish to rest in peace. That is, accomplish their goals and enjoy the fruits of their labor, now, not in afterlife, through unhindered recreation and communion. But once habituated to seeking, it is nearly impossible to abstain from it. If forced to do so, meaning and vitality dissipate, and even death may soon follow. For example, many individuals work all of their lives looking forward to a happy retirement. But since their entire lives have been defined solely by work and their careers, when retirement actually arrives, their inner reason for being evaporates. In such cases, a premature death often follows. Yet, there are no alternatives to seeking because modern Western cultures is blindly obsessed with promoting only one point of view. Even if they are lucky enough to have obtained wealth and recognition, individuals cannot enjoy them because they are too busy seeking something else, such as spirituality. Either recreation becomes work, a predetermined schedule of anticlimactic activities. All modern Western individuals are conditioned from childhood to become seekers in one or more of the four ways previously described, primarily in terms of seeking self-fulfillment. But the other goals are included to spice up the message and ensure engagement. Each individual seeks in different ways, and each has a threshold where seeking becomes a problem and needs to be objectively evaluated and questioned. Not everyone reaches this threshold, but for those who do, a reassessment is in order. How much should be sacrificed of the current self? By saving money, by working harder, by a disciplined preparation for future possibilities, by moralistic striving to become good and spiritual. For the sake of a future self, there seems to be a cultural consensus in Western democracies that the more seeking and self-sacrifice, the better, as if there were something inherently good and even heroic about investing in one's future state of being and providing for future relaxation and enjoyment. These investments tend to be evaluated as a kind of heroic... I will turn this off, sorry. Will you put pause there? Sorry about that. The same is true for spiritual seeking, going to church often and regularly, long hours of prayer and meditation, and other spiritual practices are often seen as preparation for a future state of grace or enlightenment. Sorry. They are credited as the cause of any enlightenment that occurs and provoke the admiration and envy of others who are less disciplined. In what follows, I question this point of view and suggest that these attainments would have occurred perhaps even sooner without self-sacrifice and seeking. or that they have occurred despite seeking, rather than as a result of it. Self-sacrifice in the present for future reward, especially in the history of Christianity, is not new, but has a particular saliency and urgency in the modern era. In becoming civilized, modern individuals have been conditioned to delay gratification, but for some this delay continues past retirement until death. Like self-sacrifice, goal-seeking also requires the delay of enjoyment. As a result, most learn how to delay, but few learn to spontaneously enjoy in the moment. Recreation begins to resemble work, and forced retirement results in depression and in early death, rather than enjoyment of the fruits of one's labor. Seeking self-realization or transcendence is the sacrifice of the current self for an imaginary future self, depriving the current self of pleasure, relaxation, and the natural flow of life. Natural experience is foreclosed by the necessity of the concentration, effort, and activity of seeking, even if it is only a vague fantasy with which the self is preoccupied. Seeking results in an unending and ultimately imperfect and even foolish performance upon a stage, critically observed by a godlike, tyrannical conscience, society, and ghost from one's past. The illusory choice the seeker makes is to sacrifice the quality of life now in the hope that the future quality of life will be substantially improved from what it would have been without this sacrifice. Individuals give up what they have now for something they imagine or wish to be better in the future. Why should an individual do this? This style of life, for example, rationalized as necessary for the maintenance of civilization and law and order. We are taught that individuals must be willing to delay gratification and sacrifice present. Present satisfaction for future enjoyment and achievement. But regardless of this and many other suspect reasons justifying this behavior, self-sacrificial seeking is nearly always overdone to the point that it becomes counterproductive. Many civilizations based on this kind of self-sacrifice have come and gone, yet never achieved the utopias their leaders promised, and for which successive generations of workers diligently sacrificed their lives. The question always arises, how much is enough? And further, how much is too much? Like the early Christians, modern individuals always hope that utopia is just around the corner, and that they will fairly soon enjoy the benefits of their self-sacrifice rather than passing on these benefits to some future person for whom they have ceased to exist. But this utopia, the miracles of science that will save modern individuals from death, return expanded youth and vitality, and result in freedom from labor and self-sacrifice, is no more than an illusion or wishful thinking. More often than not, self-sacrifice is nothing less than a seeking an illusion and failing to learn. Or learning too late that what the individual hoped to find was always there, but was ignored due to self-interested preoccupations. For seeking to become a problem, it is not necessary that one actually take up a discipline, learn a new vocabulary and theory, or even know very clearly what a goal is sought. It is only necessary to have a generic conditioned belief and faith in such goals. This criterion is always already met in most Western individuals by virtue of social influence, modern education, and exposure to various media, where these goals are sold to consumers of ideals, attached of course to a product, service, celebrity, or traditional authority. It is not external social behavior, but the internal psychological preoccupation with the goal of transcendence or self-realization that distinguishes those for whom seeking becomes a problem. A psychological preoccupation with fantasies of self-realization or transcendence to the point of distraction and internal conflict is the defining feature of suffering seekers. This perspective can only make sense to experience seekers who have learned something about the difficulties and frustrations of seeking. For serious experience seekers, the question becomes whether there is freedom or choice about whether to seek, or whether the individual has become an unwilling slave to ideals, destined to sacrifice a lifetime for the sake of an illusion rather than living in the present. It is therefore suggested that seeking and self-sacrifice in the process of seeking should be questioned. The actual questions are simple. Is it working? How is it working? And how much is enough? Also, what about accepting the self as it is? Things as they are, and enjoying life for what is worth now. Modern individuals already have an artificial, arbitrary date for the end of seeking, retirement. But then it is too late to recover what has been sacrificed, namely youth and the life that has already been expended. The inventions of retirement is a system of what is wrong with the modern era. The lie that present work is a virtuous sacrifice that will end in reward at the end of life. As a therapist, I have seen many forms of mental illness, but all too often discover that lurking behind the specific symptoms and complaints was some variation of the general problem of seeking. For example, I was seeing a young woman inmate in therapy in federal prison who heard critical voices that disturbed and distracted her. One of these voices was that of her sexually abusive father, who was constantly telling her what an evil person she was. Jane, a 22-year-old single woman, was arrested in a major drug bust and had several bad experiences on drugs. She had bizarre, fantastic stories to tell about her memories of sexual abuse and of the incidents that led to her arrest. She often approached others hoping to confirm or deny what her internal voices were saying to her, and to support her belief that some of these voices came from her inmates and correctional personnel. The result was that she was rejected and ridiculed by her peers. Jane had a split-off identity that had become independent and hostile to her. These hostile voices, which I will refer to collectively as her shadow identity, haunted her because of her frantic, panic-stricken, and avoidant seeking in response to earlier traumas. Seeking had caused those parts of herself that made up the shadow identity to be split off from and polarized in opposition to her seeking self. These parts were rejected because they were judged to be inferior or obstructive to her overriding goal of seeking to master the original and subsequent traumas. But these split-off parts, cells, were now mirroring the conscience that had rejected them and demanding her attention in hope of reincorporation. Jane's symptoms were therefore complicated and worsened by her seeking to cure herself of them. The symptoms caused by her seeking replaced those that had resulted directly from her original trauma. And those secondary symptoms goaded her to seek even more desperately, eventually becoming possessed and obsessed by seeking. She literally became psychologically and physically imprisoned as a result of her ceaseless strivings. The other identity in this internal drama, the guardian of her inner prison, was her taskmaster conscience that provoked, criticized, and wounded her like a burr under the yoke of a beast of burden, driving her to run off in every direction away from herself. Losing herself at every turn, she was goaded by her conscience to blindly search for herself everywhere but where she was. In her present experience, in her life, in therapy, Jane was seeking to understand what was happening to her and what was wrong, and how to cope with the critical voices. She was so preoccupied with that agenda that she could not live her life, be herself, or relax and enjoy the moment. Having, so to speak, lost her soul, and having become even more lost in searching for her soul. She had understandably panicked, not realizing that her frantic seeking was what continued to prevent the reunification of her soul with her body. Her incestuous fantasies, whether or not rooted in actual abuse, also symbolized a compensatory fantasy of fusion of the disparate parts of her psyche that she was striving so hard to keep estranged. The horror of losing control, of being taken over by an hostile identity. Goaded her into her panic-stricken battle for survival. In this battle, she was obsessed with fending off attempts by these disparate and hostile part cells that were trying to break down her resistance. What remained of her identity and reunite with her psyche as a whole. In therapy, I focused on accepting her as she was, listening to her and leaving her alone. I carefully avoided any therapeutic problem solving or prescriptions while acknowledging the importance of the concerns she brought to therapy. By avoiding the roles of critic, prescriber, or obstructor of her agenda for change, and most importantly, by just being there for her as a person she could trust and depend upon. I helped her to calm down, to slow her frantic attempts to understand, and to relax her blind groping to regain contact with herself. In therapy, I neither rejected nor scolded her resistance to reintegration. I would imagine that's very important. Which was manifested as seeking, and I was regularly available to her so that she could begin to slow off onto some of the great responsibility she felt toward herself. Because of increased self-acceptance, Jane was given an opportunity to relax, to recognize that her crisis was not as acute as she had thought, and to become conscious of herself as a tolerable human being. After a few months, she snapped out of it, as if relaxing after a panic attack. She had come down to earth, re-inhabiting her body. Suddenly, Jane was focusing on her outer world and speaking to people rather than listening to internal voices, getting caught up in bad memories. I attribute her total recovery in part to being able to sit with someone who did not judge her or have any expectations of her, with whom she could eventually ground herself and began to see herself for what she was, in her own way and on her own schedule. To whatever degree I was able to provide a benign substitute for her sadomasochistic conscience, to that degree she was relieved of the pathology of seeking. Many seekers have symptoms like hers, a paranoid concern with the assumed projected They become empty strivers seeking to fill the same void that was created by their flight from their original self. This can easily become a form of self-enslavement and madness. But in order to bring an end to empty striving, the desperate need for a solution, for something real with which to fill the void, must firstly be greatly reduced or entirely removed. This desperate need for a solution, however, cannot be removed through seeking, but only through its exhaustion or relaxation. One ancient style of coping with empty striving through relaxation rather than exhaustion is faith or trust. This type of faith is not necessarily a religious belief in God, but faith in the sense that recognizes and accepting one's fate has always been one's only and best option. This requires a discipline of waiting to see what will happen, a conscious avoidance of premature seeking to alter outcomes, and trust that the outcome of events and one's place in them will be as it ought to be. This trust may eventually be fully realized in the form of loving one's fate, an outcome that always accompanies integrative experiences. Children provide a very good example of how trust and faith works. It is only to the extent that children trust and have faith in their parents that they can be children rather than young adults. Similarly, it is only when adults can somehow stop meddling with faith and relax their guard in order to openly participate and enjoy life as it is. To do anything else constitutes a tragic refusal to live the only life one can live. The universal prehistoric religion of ancestor worship was based upon trust of former and subsequent generations of family members and in the integrity and continuity of the current family. Male heads of the household responsible for the sustenance and worship of their forefathers were guaranteed similar sustenance and worship in the afterlife by surviving family members. So I'm going to some sort of conclusion. I think the seeking could be wanting to have something in the next moment, but not projecting, not priming, not putting us in that mental state. Because looking for something, wanting something, it is already indicating some sort of lack. There is something missing, therefore I need it. So in the want, there is original lack. I think Derrida calls that the supplement, and somehow the supplement takes over. So seeking is, in the end, a confirmation of a lack. We mention also Stephen M. Rosen, the southern and the northern school of Chinese Zen. How the northern school said, go for it, try to have an undivided life, an undivided soul. But the Southern school meant it could be a problem there, because by acknowledging division in the outset, in the want, you confirmed it. So they had another approach. Their approach to the seeking was double. It was, might be, we always been undivided, and we can still be divided, because my thought of being divided is a thought coming from non-division. So it's still a same thought. So they have a double take, and thereby, according to themselves, and I think they have a point, avoiding the problem of reaffirming the lack that we already have, or pretend to have, or imagine to have. So that would be, I think what he's pointing to is a priming in lack. By seeking yourself to yourself, I lack this, I don't have it. And for every time you strive harder and harder, you will reaffirm the want. So it's a sort of a vicious circle. And that was the point also of, it was that Kahneman. David Kahneman showed that if you want to seek for something, don't put it into your mind that you are missing it presently. Just be it. And I would say this goes very close to the priming that we mentioned before with PRI. There you don't wish for something, and you don't want to have it in the future. You have it before. You have the stability, you have this unity and division, and you prime yourself. And this priming is not filled with the seeking. It is not coming from disillusion. It is not coming from discontent. It is not coming from distraction. Distraction, I would say, it's a major factor as well. Because in the end, by seeking after the next moment, you will be distracted. It is like, oh, what was that? I want to have an enjoyment. I look at this painting. And then I get fed up with that painting, and I go to the plant, and I go outside, and I jump in between things that I think will sort of heal myself. So I will get some pleasure from the painting, and that will heal my lack. Every time I do that, I will reinforce it. Therefore, it is much better to prime yourself with fullness. And fullness will be rewarding. I remember once I was in Japan, and some people told me that there is a monastery, I was like 10 miles from where I was. They said, where's the path to that monastery? And they said, well, the monks and the abbot, they have taken the path away. They did it many, many years ago. So there is no path leading to the monastery. I said, that's just cruel. Well, there is also wolves in the neighborhood. And when you get to the monastery, you can be sure you will not be let in. You could possibly wait outside, but there is no guarantee that you ever be let into the monastery. And I thought to myself, who would do that? Well, there will probably be a person who only see enjoyment in those things, who only see fullness. Because if you have one of those things in you, you will not be able to support that. You need to be pretty whole already. You need to be stable and balanced. Otherwise, you won't go through a Japanese woods, which I wouldn't recommend for anyone, for every purpose. It is terrible woods. It's like really, really treacherous. And that gave me an idea, maybe there is a grand reward. And they try to hide the reward to make the person prime even harder. And try to get those people who made themselves smaller already not to come into the convent, because they shouldn't be there, because they will only reinforce the lack. They should come from a person who sees it as only pleasure, only harmony. I think we do some PRI here, and if I can borrow color, put a small break here. So I'll try to show the split here, and now we're talking about priming. And every time you prime, always think about perfection. Never ever think of it for a second that it doesn't work. Or even worse, the idea if it works. That will put in the lack from the beginning. So priming is 100% positive. It is an image that you transfer to your own body, and you need to see it happening. Because if there is anything like maybe, or if, or could it, no, then it doesn't work. It needs to be 100% projected in a positive fashion. That it is already happening. It is already there. And that, my friends, that is the key to change. I've been trying to draw here, not very successfully, but the splits are very important in human beings because they make sure our coordination, our directionality and coordination are functioning well. And they come from every animal that is elongated, which is all animals that are bigger than a bacterium, need to be split in order for them to move. This one cannot move because it doesn't have any splits. The splits are what makes it goes up and down. A good way of showing that is using a piece of paper, and you can readily think that this going up and down motion is impossible if there are no splits. Every animal has this split. Snake, stingray, fish are all using this, and that is primordial to movement. Although it gets confused in human beings, I think it's because we tend, especially in the West, to think of the body as one thing only. This fleshy piece that moves the cogito ergo sum around, that doesn't have any effect for thinking, doing, feeling, understanding. It gets a bit problematic. But let's make the spirit whole again, because I'm beginning to realize this is a holding or healing of the soul, of the thinking. And to get into that movement that Robert Pfeiffer mentioned, the intelligent movement, that is a movement that can learn. And it doesn't need anything to learn, it learns automatically. If it becomes movable, it will become fractal, and when it's fractal, it learns. That is going back to learning. But if this is not organized this way, it will not move properly. It will be a disbalance. But instead of thinking of the disbalance, think about the perfection. Now ask Kalle to come forward here, and I'll see if we can sort of make him project the whole thing. And see in the camera here. See here. And sit down and look forward. Yeah, indeed. I see you have a piece of paper there. See if that helps to make the splits understandable. Have a look, see.
Okay.
And then try to memorize them, especially the stand figure, one standing up, and just see that you have those splits. Previously we were talking about ventral and dorsal, and here you see what is ventral and what is dorsal. This is a bit different. It goes this way and it splits the arm that way and goes to the long finger, and that makes the first split, which is that one. All animals have that split. That's the head section, which also contains your sensory organs, but it tells the body where to go. And that's a very important start of a healthy movement, a fractal healthy movement. The next split is here, goes down here, and it splits into what John Appleton called the rudder and the motor. This is the rudder and this is the motor. The rudder is our tail, and it still has the tail function. Why tail? We don't have a tail. Well, all animals have tails in some way or another. It is foundational for all living things on earth, for how they move. So we still use it for movement, and therefore there is a split there. It looks this way on a human being. Let's see what happens if we get Callie to think about this for 5 minutes. Clearly projected, shut your eyes and just relax. Be like that girl Jane that Richard E. Lee talked about. Everything's okay. There is no failure. There is no risk of being bad or not succeeding in this test. It's not a test at all. So whenever you feel ready, you can slowly stand up. And you can begin walking towards the TV. Just wait until I zoom in a bit here. Yeah. Have a stroll to the TV and then go to the other chair. So what I mean here is he's seen the pictures, the drawings, and that is valid for everyone. So he understands them, but he's struggling with projecting them. Leave that struggle, just do it, because it is obvious here that he is broader over the shoulders. He's moving in a more flexible way. So in a way, the PRR images are really, really easy. And your system knows what they mean, because you are of the species animal standing either on 4 legs or on 2. They all follow the same system. And the splits needs to be there, not stopped. Let's say try walk again towards the other chair. You can do it a little bit quicker. So the movement is easier, it is more fluent, it is not as, what can you say, waiting for results. He just walks, he just does it. And this is a very good example what we should do instead of waiting for results and trying to feel if it's correct, or also as me as an onlooker and you sitting looking at this video, the judgment is not there, because just project the whole thing and it will work, as we can see here quite marvelously. Just sit down for a while. So what we don't need to do is to question the things and wondering whether we understand them or not. You can be quite sure you understand them, because the whole movement system is built on them. And looking one time is more than enough to prime yourself with them. And that caused this change in movement. I can also see if I think I can see something happen to his neck as well. Yeah, it's not as tense. He was slouching his neck before, and the head went down like this all the time, down, down. But now it doesn't. It stands, and he found his sitting bones. So if you also put this in combination with the dorsal ventral, and when you can, add the chakras, I think it will be quite strong. And the lesson for Richard E. Lind is, every time you seek to have something and you put in, there is something missing, and then you need a supplement, you need some additive or something, that will put in lack from the very beginning. Just as was the case with all the philosophers. Almost all of them are complaining that they are lacking, life is bland, it doesn't lead them to pleasure. It was the same with my teachers in philosophy. They were never ever happy, but they were still seeking to get the understanding. And this is what Richard E. Lind is showing. This is how it works. So in a way, he is a bit of a spiritual master. He shows that the constant lack is not there. We are whole as we are from the beginning. And there is no chance we can work in another way than this two-split fashion. All animal life do that. And that was excellently shown by Kalle here. Thank you very much for your help. And I say good afternoon to all of you and have a very pleasant day. Bye bye.